in the history of our civilization, the introduction of a new thought has brought skepticism, even ridicule. Despite this, there always has remained the duty and inalienable right to tell the people the truth. The motion picture you are about to see is true. It is not fiction. Much of the information in it has never been told. You will see it here for the first time.
I am here to discuss the so-called flying saucers.
Talk to you or concern you about the unknown and the unidentified flying object?
Oh, yes, we discussed it at every conference that we had with the military, and they never were able to make me a concrete report on.
Do you have anything on the subject, sir?
No, I haven't anything on the subject, and there's always things like that going on.
Your opinion of these new sightings of unidentified objects?
With all due respect to the Air Force, I believe that some of them will prove to be of interplanetary origin. During a 3-year investigation, I found that many pilots have described objects of substance and high speed. One case, pilots reported their plane was buffeted by an object which passed them at 500 miles an hour. Obviously, this was a solid object, and I believe it was from outer space.
People always ask, if UFOs are real, why don't they just land on the White House front lawn? It doesn't seem like a lawn landing has occurred, but a UFO drive-by has. Washington D.C., July 1952. What started as a quiet weekend transformed into one of the most documented UFO incidents ever. Radar scopes lit up. Civilian and military pilots reported strange lights. Jets were scrambled. The combination of quality eyewitnesses, radar data, missing stars, and the sheer number of mass sightings over multiple days shows that something unexplainable happened. Let's take a deep dive and look at some of the pieces of evidence that can be easy to miss. This is Truth in Tinfoil, here with the first episode of UFOs Undeniable.
On July 29th, 1952, at the Pentagon, a press conference was held. This is the actual official transcript of that conference. Among those participating were Major General Roger M. Ramey, Director of Operations, USAF; Colonel Donald L. Bauer, Technical Analysis Division, Air Technical Intelligence Center; and Captain Edward J. Ruppelt, Aerial Phenomenon Branch, Air Technical Intelligence Center. This is Major General John A. Samford, Director of Intelligence, United States Air Force, who conducted the conference.
These are clips from the 1956 documentary UFOs, The True Story of Flying Saucers, created by producer Clarence Green. This film takes a serious look at the UFO phenomenon. I'd highly recommend checking the film out, link down below. During the documentary, there are recreations of UFO events, but also an analysis of real footage of 2 separate UFO incidents. These 2 events were the Mariana UFO incident in 1950, where multiple UFOs flew over a minor league baseball stadium, and Delbert Newhouse's Salt Lake City UFO film in 1952. The footage is definitely very interesting. It is taken as serious by main character of the film, Al Chop. Al Chop starts out as a skeptical member of the public info sector at Wright-Patterson Field in Ohio, which is ever present in UFO lore. The climax of the movie focuses on the Washington D.C. UFO flap of 1952, where Chop served as the press officer for Project Blue Book, which was the government's official study of UFOs at that time. While Chop was portrayed by an actor, he personally reviewed every single line in the script that was said by him and closed the doc by stating UFOs are a physical phenomenon of unknown origin. Despite skepticism or ridicule, it is important we dive into cases like this and try to seek the truth. This is the story of the Washington, D.C. UFO flap, July 1952. 11:40 p.m., July 19th, 1952, radar controller Edward Nugent at Washington National Airport spotted 7 mysterious fast-moving blips south of Washington, D.C. Senior controller Harry Barnes who at that time had been in a similar role for about 9 years, initiated equipment checks. Everything was operating normally. Barnes later told investigators, "We knew immediately that a very strange situation existed. Their movements were completely radical compared to those of normal aircraft." Across the field, tower operator Howard Coughlin also confirmed visual lights synced with the radar. Meanwhile, at Andrews Air Force Base, William Brady watched an orange, flaming orb that hovered, changed direction and altitude several times. Coughlin was quoted as saying, "It was a good-sized light, yellow to orange in color. At first it looked like a great big star. Then it began to move in a manner which made you realize it couldn't be a star. There was no unusual high speed about its movements, and at times it seemed to hover. We could see it moving around like that for about 15 minutes. It just disappeared into the northwest sky." End quote. Years later, in 2002, 50 years to be exact, Coughlin was quoted as stating, "I saw it on the radar screen and out the window." End quote. That means you have visual and radar confirmation. Keep in mind, the radar experts with years of experience were stating that these were actual objects. Here are some of the anomalous characteristics from the radar data according to NICAP archives. The object went over 7,200 miles per hour, conducted 90-degree turns, something we couldn't and still can't do at that speed, stopped immediately and reversed direction. Object was tracked going from 130 miles per hour on radar to invisible on radar, which suggests it increased its speed from 130 miles per hour to 500 miles per hour in 3 to 5 seconds. 2 objects over the White House, 1 near the Capitol, restricted airspace, and they repeatedly vanished, then reappeared, all as solid objects on the radar. We've already had radar data from experienced operators aligned with sightings from reliable tower controllers. But that's just the start. Capital Airlines pilot Casey Pierman, a pilot of 17 years, on standby at National Airport, watched 6 white tailless lights for 14 minutes. Barnes in the tower traffic control room communicated to Pierman via radio while they watched the ordeal. Quote, "Each sighting coincided with a hit on radar. Then the light streaked off at high speed and disappeared from our scope." End quote. Pierman continued, quote, "In my years of flying, I've seen a lot of falling or shooting stars, whatever you call them. But these were much faster than anything like that I've ever seen. They were moving too fast for that. They were about the same size as the brighter stars, and they were much brighter than our 6,000 foot altitude. I couldn't estimate the speed accurately. Please remember I didn't speak of them as flying saucers, only fast-moving lights." Pierman's first officer, Charles Wheaton, saw these anomalies as well and was convinced he was looking at the unknown. Also, as a reminder, it was common in this day and age for stigma to follow any pilots who reported seeing flying saucers at this time. Meanwhile, Capital National Airlines Flight 610 added to the growing sightings pile. They reported a light following them all the way from Richmond, Virginia to about 4 miles from the Capitol. Not all trustworthy sightings were in the air. Saul Pett, a news reporter in River Edge, New Jersey, had a strong quote of what he saw that matched the timeline of the sightings, as he stated it was heading towards Washington. Quote, "It looked like a sphere, so deeply orange-colored that it appeared almost the shade of rust. It was as silent as death. It was moving too fast and evenly to be a balloon. I saw a flying saucer, and you can't convince me that there is no such animal." End quote. As the evening waned, the unknown flying objects disappeared. Newspapers all over the country picked up on the story. Of course, this rocked the nation. Some may have waved it off, but the Air Force took it seriously. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, always at the center of UFO investigations during this time, had their Air Technical Intelligence Center investigate. That is, however, once they were made aware of the fact. At the time, head of UFO investigations Edward Ruppelt, and father of the term UFO, first learned of the sightings when he purchased a newspaper Monday morning. That week, the U.S. would be captivated by flying saucers, but there was more to come over the Capitol. Exactly 1 week later, on July 26, 1952, things really heated up as the skies lit up again. At 8:15 p.m., both National and Andrews radars logged multiple targets. These targets were flying over restricted airspace, including the Capitol and the White House. Here's a transcript of a conversation from Andrews Air Force Base and Washington National from the Blue Book archives. This is showing both Andrews and Washington getting targets on their radar. We also got a description from Washington, with a pilot saying that they saw something that looked like a meteor, and one was off his wing. Meanwhile, Master Sergeant Charles Harrison saw bluish-white lights that reportedly did not have the characteristics of shooting stars. There were no trails and seemed to go out rather than disappear. They traveled faster than any shooting star he has ever seen. This added yet another credible witness to the growing pile during this event. For a first-hand account of these events, let's hear from a member of the Washington Radio Traffic Control Team, James Ritchie, in an interview given at that time.
Tell us some facts about the current fuss over flying saucers is Mr. James Ritchie of the Civil Aeronautics Authority, who is one of the men who first spotted and plotted the so-called saucers on radar at the Washington airport. What has actually happened?
Well, we've seen quite a few of them, John. Probably well over 100. We've seen these unidentified objects on our scope. And all in all, we've had 24 times where the pilot flew to where we told him there was a pip. He would request that he would be vectored to it. We would vector him over to it. 24 different times lights were seen. We had asked him to describe the light, describe the object. He would either say it was a white light. Most of them said white light. One pilot said it was yellow, and it would go to red and back to yellow. We asked him to describe it. He said the only description he could give is it's very attractive. Other pilots saw two that he said were blue. So we've had them pretty well described in all different ways.
Now, I know you called in the military, the Air Force people sometimes. What did the Air Force people do when they got up there with the jets and these lights?
Well, we would vector the Air Force people, the jets, to the saucers as they appeared on our scope. They would go after them, and they didn't seem to be able to make any enclosure on it. They would go down at the target, they would see a white light, and the target would pull away from them or disappear. They would see what they thought was the white light all around.
Well, now, what do you think about these signatures that you see on your scope?
That's a good question, John.
With confirmed visual sightings and radar data climbing, the military responded. By 9:30 p.m., radar returns darted erratically, some with estimated speeds of up to 7,000 miles per hour. F-94 Starfires from Newcastle Air Force Base were sent airborne. Captain John McHugo saw nothing, but Lieutenant Bill Patterson, his wingman, observed 4 white lights in pursuit. He chased them until they vanished. He was quoted as saying, "I tried to make contact with the bogies below 1,000 feet, but the radar controllers vectored us around. I saw several bright lights. I was at my maximum speed, but even then I had no closing speed. I ceased chasing them because I saw no chance of overtaking them. I was vectored into new objects. Later I chased a single bright light, which I estimated about 10 miles away. I lost visual contact with it about 2 miles." End quote. Not as widely known, but that wasn't the end of these lights, according to Edward Ruppelt. In his 1955 book, The Report on UFOs, he's quoted as saying, "A few minutes after the targets left the radar scopes in Washington, people in the area around Langley Air Force Base near Newport News, Virginia, began to call Langley Tower to report that they were looking at weird bright lights that were rotating and giving off alternating colors. A few minutes after the calls began to come in, the tower operators themselves saw the same or a similar light, and they called for an interceptor. F-94s were then scrambled at Langley to pursue. Once they got an actual radar lock with their jet, the lock was broken in mere seconds. Multiple lock-ons were achieved, broken again, and then the targets were gone. Suddenly, once they were gone from the area around Virginia, D.C. radar picked the objects up again. So what we have here is objects were in Washington D.C. area, jets chased them, they were gone, and then they appeared in the Virginia skies. Once the jets were sent to Virginia skies, they were gone from Virginia skies, and then they reappeared in Washington D.C. again. After the game of cat and mouse, the sun began to rise and the jets were low on fuel. The unidentified objects would fade off radar screens. The wild night was over, but many questions remained. President Truman requested a briefing on just what was happening over important skies. With pressure from the press, public, and politicians mounting, the government was forced to scramble for answers, some of which they still didn't have, according to Ruppelt. July 29th, Major General John Sanford stages a press briefing, the biggest since World War II. An official explanation offered was temperature inversions, which bend radar waves, while some visual sightings could be mistaken for shooting stars or meteors. When you Google this press conference, you can find the National Archives version on YouTube, which is trimmed to about 5 minutes. You can find a full transcript of the press conference, which I will be linking down below. One of the most fascinating parts of this press conference, at least the National Archives trimmed version, is reserved for the very end. Marine and former skeptic Donald Kehoe had this to say about what he believed is happening to the press.
With all due respect to the Air Force, I believe that some of them will prove to be of interplanetary origin. During a 3-year investigation, I found that many pilots have described objects of substance and high speed. One case, pilots reported their plane was buffeted by an object which passed them at 500 miles an hour. Obviously, this was a solid object, and I believe it was from outer space.
Kehoe is fascinating, and from the inside could see that the Air Force was aiding in the cover-ups of UFOs from the general public. You can still find interviews with them online. Highly recommend doing more of a deep dive into Kehoe. Let's focus on Sanford here. Sanford seems to give some dubious and dodgy answers at best to some questions. I actually have to give some credit to the press here because they do not let him get off easy. Let's listen to some of Sanford's answers that made the National Archives video cut that is common when you Google this press conference or listen on YouTube.
A certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things. It is this group of observations that we now are attempting to resolve. Our basic difficulty in dealing with these is that there is no measurement of them that makes it possible for us to put them in any pattern that would be profitable for a deliberate, custom sort of analysis to take the next step. We have, as of date, come to only one firm conclusion with respect to this remaining percentage, and that is that it does not contain any pattern of purpose or of consistency that we can relate with to any conceivable threat to the United States. I can say that the recent sightings are in no way connected with any secret development by any department of the United States.
Now let's take a look at some of the answers that didn't make the video cut that is common on the National Archives video. I'm not going to read all of them, but you can definitely take a deep dive if you'd like. There are some interesting answers, to put it mildly. While I advise reading the whole thing, we're going to hop around and look at the most interesting responses in my opinion. Starting on page 13, the press, as we can see, asks Sanford to confirm these are physical objects. Farther down, he discusses that these aren't rare occurrences, and experts have been trying to get to the bottom of them. On page 16, we have the press push to confirm that the radar experts report solid targets on the radar, not weather, when forcing Sanford to confirm what the military thinks he gives one of my personal favorite interview answers ever. I think that the highest probability is that these are phenomena associated with the intellectual and scientific interests that we are on the road to learn more about, but that there is nothing in them that is associated with material or vehicles or missiles that are directed against the US, end quote. I wonder why that one didn't make the Video National Archives cut when you search it on YouTube. I'll let you make your own assumptions, but it's pretty funny to me. Samford even labels this a 50-50 proposition of being temperature inversions. Didn't matter. The press ran with that as the headline. Some version of Air Force debunks Washington UFOs as weather went out across the nation the next day. A report attempting to explain the Washington sightings as merely temperature inversions was released in 1953 by the Civil Aeronautics Administration. This report states that these temperature inversions caused the sightings and were likely mirages. However, they were using weather data from August 13th and 14th in 1952. The error with this is that the sightings occurred in July, so they're using the wrong dates, and they're trying to extrapolate the data. There's further issues with this. Ironically, support for the Washington D.C. UFOs being undeniable accidentally comes from an infamous study that many people believe focuses on debunking UFOs. The Condon Report was written in 1968 and headed by Edward Condon from University of Colorado. It is widely panned. The conclusion of the study, that UFOs were not worthy of further study, was not supported by data in the study itself. And the perfect example works here. According to Bruce Maccabee, a physicist with the Navy, he was quoted as saying, "They proved in their own study that there wasn't enough temperature inversion to cause this effect," end quote. Don Berliner, former member of the National Guard turned NICAP member, helped to shut down the temperature inversion narrative. Quote, "The atmospheric lenses and strong inversions, postulated as explanations by Menzel and others, would need temperatures of several thousand kelvins in order to cause the mirages attributed to them. That kind of inversion would turn everything on the Earth to cinders," end quote. Gotta love Berliner here showing how ridiculous of an explanation that was at the time. Let's review the facts. Temperature inversions are real events and can have impacts on radar systems. However, at the time, Ruppelt interviewed electronics and engineer specialists, asking if this could have been weather anomalies. He was met with a resounding and confident no, that these were solid objects. Other targets, specifically weather radar hits, were on the scope during that time, but they were common in the Washington area and ignored. Ruppelt is quoted as saying, "On each night that there was a sighting, there was a temperature inversion, but it was never strong enough to affect the radar the way temperature inversions normally do. On each occasion, I checked the strength of the inversion according to the methods used by the Air Defense Command Weather Forecast Center," end quote. Ruppelt is also quoted as saying, "There's another interesting fact. Hardly a night passed in June, July, and August in 1952 that there wasn't an inversion in Washington. Yet the slow-moving, solid radar targets appeared on only a few nights. So the Washington National Airport sightings are still unknowns," end quote.
Highly critical of your own government's attitude towards UFOs.
Indeed I have, yes. I've taken a very good look at the American official investigation program, Project Blue Book, run by the Air Force, and I have quite unequivocally described it to scientific colleagues back in the States as superficial and incompetent.
More credible support comes from James McDonald, who I'm actually conducting more of a deep dive on right now. James has quite the resume to be the authority on this specific incident. Atmospheric physicist, meteorologist, he knew his way around temperature inversions. According to this scan of his presentation, UFOs, the greatest scientific problem of our times, McDonald claimed that the Air Force explanation was absolutely absurd after reviewing the data. McDonald was a man of integrity. He gave multiple lectures in front of Congress, and not just pushing for further UFO studies. In 1970, he gave a lecture before Congress pushing to lessen usage of supersonic transport planes. Their usage would cause harm to the ozone layer, he argued, which at that time wasn't widely accepted by science. He was ridiculed. One congressman even used his belief in just the further study of UFOs meant we should ignore the data about the ozone layer. This is a great summary of why we should ignore the stigma currently surrounding the UFO phenomenon and keep reviewing credible UFO cases as the data supports it. For James McDonald, unfortunately there wasn't a happy ending. Like a rather high number of other public figures in the UFO world, McDonald died young at 51 in 1971. He was found in the desert in Arizona of suicide, with a revolver and a note. Although this case happened over 70 years ago, we have newer data that cannot be ignored. In 2022, Dr. Beatriz Villaorel heads the Vasco project, which is located at the Nordic Institute for Theoretical Physics in Stockholm, Sweden. Using images captured at the Palomar Observatory in California and sourced from the US Naval Observatory, the team made a startling discovery. On July 19th and July 27th, 1952, the exact nights of the Washington D.C. UFO flap, multiple faint, star-like objects appeared in photographic plates, then vanished entirely moments later. One standout image from that Palomar Sky survey even caught 3 bright points that existed in one single exposure, but were gone in the next. Keep in mind that this is pre-Sputnik, which is the first man-made satellite that was launched into space, and it's predating it by 5 years, from 1957, Sputnik, and then 1952, which is the Washington D.C. UFO flap. This in itself doesn't necessarily confirm anything, but taken into account with everything else, suggests an even deeper look at all the data. Interestingly enough, even though the data definitely suggests further study, and was submitted for peer review, Villaorel and the team have had a tough time being granted that peer review. Again, the common theme here is the data is supporting a closer look, and stigma is holding us back from serious progress. For a more detailed look at this study, please support Villaorel, her team, and the debrief, which is where you can find this summary article down below. Fascinating stuff in this one. Actually, a small update. At the moment of this recording, July 27th, 2025, Villaorel and her team are actually teasing a groundbreaking new study, so good timing for this recording and keep an eye out for that. Here's the proof. Dual sight radar locked on sustained targets. Commercial and military pilots directly observed matching visuals. Radar and visual synchrony over 2 weekends. Jets engaged objects and the objects evaded them intentionally. And temperature inversion theory is flawed and goes against the data and experience of multiple credible observers, as well as the opinions of people like Ruppelt and Al Chop. Throw in the cherry on top with the potential of the vanishing stars, and we have a case that's so undeniable it helped lead to the Robertson panel. As we can see from FOIA documents released far later, from 1953 on, the CIA's suggested educational program for its stance on UFOs, debunking of course, including through mass media, TV, the news, etc. It's a major reason why we have this stigma against UFOs today, and it's also why it's very important to view credible UFO cases through an unbiased lens. Something anomalous occurred over DC in July 1952. Was it non-human intelligence? Military secret? We don't know. The government explanation doesn't add up. We're left with undeniable evidence of something beyond explanation. If this case intrigued you, hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more deep investigations. Next episode, we'll take a look at the more speculative side of the rabbit hole with our first episode of the Tinfoil Reports. This is Truth in Tinfoil. See you next time.